It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ed Landa today. The title of his talk is Doing History as an Environmental Scientist, and I think, in that vein, it's kind of nice to know a little bit of history about the speaker. So I'm not sure if Ed grew up in New York, but got his bachelor's degree from City College in New York, got a degree in geology, and then went on to the University of Minnesota for a master's and PhD in soil science, and did some really great work that resonates with me for his master's and PhD on everything from iron oxyhydroxides and how they function in environmental systems, and then studying things like radioactive byproducts like technetium-99 or technetium-99, however you want to pronounce it. And then I think also, if I'm not mistaken, you were a postdoc for a while at Oak Ridge National Lab.
Oregon State.
Okay, Oregon State. But didn't you work at Oak Ridge National, or had some connection with, oh, sorry. I thought at one point we talked about that. Okay. But in recent years, Ed's got a lot of recognition with his work at the U.S. Geological Survey, and then he's also an adjunct faculty in our department of ENST. And so, also Ed has also does a lot with scholarships in our department. He works with Manners, but most notably, I think the Landa Johnson Scholarship for juniors and seniors who are pursuing a degree in ENST as a contributor to that. So, with that, Ed, I'll give it away to you.
Okay, thank you. It's really nice to be here today, so thank you, Jared. Okay, so what I want to talk about is doing history as an environmental scientist, not as a historian, because none of us in this room are probably historians. So this is the kind of thing you learn on the fly. So I would like to share with you some of my learning curve, and I'm not sure where I'm at on that curve right now, but someplace. Sorry.
I think Jonathan was missing a Zoom, so if we click, now try it. There you go.
Okay. So some of the elements of my talk today, storytelling, something that when I was in grad school, we never talked about storytelling, and now we talk about it a lot, which I think is a great thing. We're going to talk about science and technology, about chronology. We're going to talk about the Oppenheimer movie, because it's really central to what I'm working on. A personal narrative in terms of my path on historical work, and with elements which I hope will be a career pep talk on things that you may want to think about folding into your careers as it progresses. So first I want to talk about the ENST family. So I am not the only person doing history here, and there's three of us that I will highlight, and this I think is a given for all of us. You don't go out and find the topics find you. If you're a historian, you go looking for topics. We take these things on as sort of add-ons to what we're typically doing because they grab our attention, or in some cases, because we're working, say, for a consulting company where there's forensic issues involved, like determining prior legacy contamination at a site. So those are two places where history comes in. Okay, so the first person is Bob Jaden. In 2020, Bob published this book on the history of forestry in Delaware. And Bob and I both were working at the Delaware Public Archive essentially at the same time during pre-COVID and COVID times. Pat Kanga's 2022, this history of radioecology, really a terrific book. It really shows the roots of modern ecology are heavily based within radio ecology, mainly because of funding. After World War II, there was a tremendous need to establish environmental pathways of radionuclides, radiation biology studies. So this was really one of the drivers of the modern field of ecology. So the table 1.1 in the book I loved because one of my interests besides soil science, history, is movies. So here's this thing, movies, horror movies from the 1954-57 era that had to do with radiation effects. And just because this predates almost every one of the students, I'm sure, I'm going to give you the summary of these. For me, Godzilla was formative in my life. So Godzilla is radiation in Japan, very much focused on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My favorite here is really the last one, Attack of the Crab Monsters. And I thought, in terms of a Maryland-based institution, we should throw some Old Bay in. Some, I added some to the slide there. But these movies, every one of these, the creature was a mutation from environmental radioactivity. So Them was up there with Godzilla from 1954. And so it resonated with me later in my career because I did this study on ant mounds in Oregon in 1977. So I found these bizarre, like knee-high cylindrical ant mounds, and I wound up writing it up for an entomology journal. And so then later in my career, 2015, this is where my movie interests came in, and I wrote a chapter on Phase 4, which is a really underrated movie. So if you ever get to see it, I recommend it. It was the only movie ever made by this guy, Saul Bass, whose major claim to fame was he did the opening titles on many of the big blockbuster movies in Hollywood, Psycho and movies like that. But he only got to make one movie, and this was it. And so this is Saul Bass's columns. They were beautiful. They were very micaceous, and the sun would glint off them. And there's my mini version. So thank you, Saul. So change over time is, historians talk about this all the time. And when I heard this, I said, well, that's what we talk about all the time also, right? How things change over time. Most of our graphs are along these lines. So I just wanted to show you the history timeline and my episodic intersections with it. So this thing about where the topics find you, the model I like to use, it's like an EKG. It doesn't run, it's not a continuous wave. It's there's spikes, long periods, another spike, and that's it. These topics will hit you. They either interest you or they don't. You pay no attention, some attention, or lots of attention. And that's, I think, for most of us, this is how we get involved in projects like the ones I'll describe. So, so you see there, Pierre and Marie Curie, this is pre-1939. So everything changes in 1939 with the discovery of nuclear fission. And the curves I have there, those are called the fission yield curves. So they're always this bimodal distribution, and one mass is always around 100, and one is always around 140. So when you think about it, uranium-238 is 100 plus 140 about, right? So that's that the fission fragments tend to fall along that those mass numbers. So for my PhD work, I worked on technetium-99, in other words, on the first peak there. I've also done some work on cesium-137, that's on the second peak, okay, yeah. So, so then in 1945, per the Oppenheimer movie, we had the Trinity test, and then 2 detonations in Japan, and then many, many detonations in either the Pacific or at the Nevada test site, as well as the Russians doing similar testing in Siberia. So that's one source of environmental radioactivity, fallout, and that's what really drove the stuff that Pat Kangas was looking at, the fallout issue. So the picture in the middle, that's at Chernobyl. So in 1991, I was there with a group from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we were looking at mostly fission products, cesium-137 being the major one. So it was 5 years after the accident, so the radiation levels, there wasn't really no external exposure issues, but that building in the back, that's the monolith, not like the monoliths we have in H.J. Patterson. That was the structure they built over the crippled reactor. And that's me taking some core samples. So my work with the USGS, as I described, was mostly on uranium mill tailings, and I'll get into what that is. But the very last thing here is the current hot thing in radioactivity, really, medical radioisotopes, mostly for cancer therapy. And these are specifically tied to radium-226, and I'll get into that more. Okay, so that's one of my major interests. My other one involves work with Paul on mosquitoes. So when I came here in 2010, Bruce James introduced me to Paul right outside that door there, and we started talking about our mutual interest in tires, and not tires for our cars, but scrap tires, disposed tires, and tires as habitat for mosquitoes. So my previous work had been on tire wear particles. It's the little pieces of tire that are sprayed all over the road as you drive. And back then, no one really was paying much attention to them, and they certainly did not class them as microplastics, but now they are grouped in with microplastics, and they're the biggest source, from what I read, of microplastics on a weight basis. So they're getting more public attention. So in 2010, so I actually can't remember exactly how this hit me, but I was looking at something and I realized that I came across this thing about ditching of salt marshes. And about the same time, I had been playing with Google Maps, and I saw these things that looked like they must be man-made features. So between putting those two things together, these grid-like patterns and the historical record, I decided this is pretty interesting. So I started working at the Delaware Public Archives, which has a tremendous collection on the mosquito ditching that was done in the 1930s. So Paul and I are hoping to put something together where we combine the history with the good and the bad of ditching into some kind of paper with, hopefully not, it could be a journal article, but also something with more outreach to a broader audience, because I think there is an audience for this. Okay, so a little more on history. So the subject of context, if you just skim through that wording at the bottom, historians like to talk about context, and if you're not a historian, it's an area where I think we don't have a lot of strength. I certainly didn't, and I was, I will give you one example. So the Technetium 99 I worked on was, most of it came from defense. This was in 1972 to 75, I was working on this. I did not realize that was mostly defense-related waste, meaning bomb production, till, I'm embarrassed to say, decades later. Then all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I looked at a curve of nuclear energy. There was very little nuclear power plant production in the early 70s. It was just barely getting started. So the tremendous volume of waste had been built up from weapons production. So the reason we got funded was undoubtedly due to the defense waste, not the nuclear power industry. But so that's the context, knowing what was going on in the world was where we had peace, war, blah, blah, blah. And context is something that historians they immediately gravitate to that. So in 2003, for Health Physics Journal, I reviewed this book, and this was really providing the contextual basis of uranium mill tailings management, which I had been working on, let's see, at that point for 23 years maybe, and this was a real eye-opener for me, all the political, historical background and the legal background on this. So like I said, this is episodic. We're not experts at the beginning, it's by osmosis mostly. So this is I was trying to think of what is a good example of context. So the Three Little Pigs, so the Three Little Pigs story we would tell is, the wolf confronted the pigs and said, I will huff and puff and blow your house down. But the context would be, there was a housing shortage, the wolves are an endangered species, and exposure to PM 2.5 associated with confined animal feeding operations had decreased the pulmonary capacity in the local wolf population. So the story becomes a little more complicated, a little more textured, and I think a little more interesting in the end. So how do you learn context? Well, none of us have the time to go back and take a second degree, clearly, but there are ways to do it. These are two of my methods. One is online, one on campus. This online colloquium on energy history, about once a week, I sit in on the seminar, and then I go to, sometimes at the School of Public Policy, they have a real interest in nuclear security. So I've heard some very good talks over there. So you just pick it up on the fly, really. So here's a recent review in Science, and here is the statement of the reviewer. He criticizes the person for not delving deeply into primary sources. So primary sources translates into original documents, archival documents. Now so much of this online, it doesn't necessarily have to reside in an archive, but it's original documents, not digested histories, then presented one more time. And that's what I'll be talking about, is archival work. Okay, so I've told you all the reasons why we shouldn't be doing history. We don't understand context as well as historians, blah, blah. But what do we know? What do we bring to the table? Well, disciplinary strength. We know the environment, right? And there are many historians who deal in environmental history who admit clearly they do not have the same scientific background as people like we have gathered in this group. So we do bring a lot to the table, and I think talking together more is great, but we should also understand that it's not just context, it's content and context, and our strength is content, okay? So, like I said, I'm not going to take additional classes, but I've developed sources that I rely on heavily. So one of them is this book, this green book by Lawrence Badash, Radioactivity in America, just fantastic book. It covers the pre-fission history of radium and uranium. There's also people out there you can talk to, like this Bruce Cameron Reed, who wrote this really excellent book on the science of the Manhattan Project. And at least 3 or 4 times now, I've just emailed him, and we have a dialogue on, he's a physicist, but, and some nitty-gritty questions I've gotten answered by just talking to Bruce. Here are some of the other ones. The Richard Rhodes book is the classic. I was shocked when I got it fairly late in my interest in this, and I always thought, well, this is a lay book, it's not going to have detail. It's just the most incredible book. The level of detail in the endnotes, the footnotes, everything. It's a superb piece. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and just a great book, Oppenheimer. So, I'm heavily involved already in this project, and then the Oppenheimer movie I hear about, and it's a movie, so my antenna is already going, they're great. So I'm checking weekly, when is it gonna show up at when is it show? So the first matinee of the first day that it opened, I was there, and it's a great movie. I've watched it probably 4 times since then, and every time I learn more. There's stuff, it's so fact-rich that you don't get it all unless you watch it with the subtitles on and you watch it over and over again. So the book is intimidating. I have it. I have not read it yet. I will use it as a resource. But the movie, just the best, really. Okay, so I have what I call my major projects. That's this nuclear armament I'll describe now, and the ditching one. So each of those has some spin-offs, and those are the things that I've actually been working on heavily this year. So what they are is things that they're discrete nuggets that don't fit really with the main body of work, but are just too good not to do something with. And it describes it's a vignette, not a treatise, and it has rigor, scientific rigor, but not rigor mortis. I'm aiming for a general audience. Well, I shouldn't say. I'm aiming for a broad audience. In some cases, like the paper I'll show you, it's in Elements magazine, which is from the Mineralogical Society and Geochemical Society. So it's aimed at a broad geoscience audience, and other things are aiming for a broad lay audience, really. Okay, so what are some of the potential benefits for doing these? For me, they've been very good, because when you're doing a long-term project, the stuff, you start to forget it after, you're working at the archive for 6 months, and then 6 months later, you've forgotten a lot of it. But if you keep coming back to it and have it close at hand to work on these spin-offs, it keeps the material fresh, and it keeps your writing skills fresh. I think writing is like a muscle. It has to be exercised. 2 of the advantages that I didn't realize when I got into this is you get to work with some really excellent editors, and not just editors who dole out papers to reviewers, editors who you can have a dialogue with. How can this be improved? Just, it's really been an eye-opener for me, and just a real delight to work with these. And on one of these, I'll show you, you even get to work with an art director, which is, something you don't get on your typical journal article. And it's outreach. We get to reach a larger, broader audience. So this was the first paper. This is December 2023 in Elements magazine. I sent a query into the editor. I said, here's what I'm interested in. She was very good. She said, well, I don't really know you. Tell me who you are and what the paper is about. So I sent her a capsule summary. Oh, she liked it. And then we had a really good back and forth dialogue in this thing, and she featured it in the editor's column in the front. And the term teachable moment came up, because what this paper was based on one sheet of paper from the National Archives over here in College Park. I was flipping through this stack of papers, so in 1945, the occupation of Japan started. This group called SCAP, Supreme Commander, Allied Forces in the Pacific, that was General MacArthur. They were going around finding nuclear materials in Japan. And so these were the logs of every visit they made to sites. And this one said it was from the Shimadzu Corporation, who, some of you have worked with Shimadzu equipment in your lab. Well, Shimadzu had a data sheet in there. It was almost blank, just a few entries, and it says 1.00 grams radium. So, in your data handling, you don't really feed 1.00s too much, right? So it caught my interest. Flip it over on the back, and the amount remaining was 0.9988 something. So what it was, which I deciphered working with it, they were a supplier of radium to Japanese labs and hospitals. So they bought a gram of radium in Europe, and then they were selling it, and they actually sold it all to one hospital in Japan. So why would the SCAP people be interested in radium? Well, the initiator for an atomic bomb used either radium or polonium with something like beryllium. And so, if someone had a radium supply, they got a red flag put on. This is a subject of interest. This one went no place, actually. It was really just for scientific and hospital use. But you can see from the second column, it really was the impetus for giving this talk. Because one of the things I realized when you're working in an archive is the data comes at you like a slide projector, the old-fashioned Kodak slide like this. So, when we're looking at our data, we spread it out on the table, and let me look at that. You can't do that in an archive. If you have one more sheet turned than the one you're looking at, people, they come over and they stand next to you, and they give you a difficult time. So you can only look at a page at a time in an archive, but it's an interesting way to look at it. So this thing, the slide projector came, I looked at it, that's interesting, filed that one away, and it turned out to be a paper unto itself, really. Okay, so there's about 6 of us an informal early radioactivity group. One guy's at the Pennsylvania Department of Environment, one is a retired NRC, another is a retired radiochemist at NIST, and people like this. One is a radiation oncologist. So one of them, the NIST guy, circulated this picture, just no date, and it had a list of who was in the picture. So the picture had, I think, 3 Nobel Prize winners, and it was at Berkeley. That's all I knew from the beginning. So when you look at it, so this is Ernest Lawrence right here. So if you saw the movie, this is Josh Hartnett, is Ernest Lawrence, and lo and behold, up here, this very boyish looking, that's J. Robert Oppenheimer. And this is the yoke, the big magnet that surrounds the accelerator that was used at Berkeley that developed the uranium isotope separation technique. So this became, that picture is one of those pictures that it stops you in your tracks. You go, wow, I gotta learn more about this. So what I learned in just very quick internet searching was more about Lawrence. So Lawrence got his master's at the University of Minnesota, where I got my master's. So it interested me, and his life story, I don't have time to go into. It's just amazing. I'll just tell you, 2 guys from a tiny little town in South Dakota were the biggest drivers of the Manhattan Project in its very beginning. And the rest of the story, see me in January and I'll send it to you. So here's for the students, the word of wisdom. If you want to have a sustainable textile being in your life, stick to schools with the same letter. So I was a Minnesota Gopher. It pairs very well with a nice fleece, a taupe fleece. So I can go to any event now, and I actually gone to the Minnesota Maryland football game, basketball game, and I've moved between each side incognito. So Jared had mentioned about, so it's a little cut off, but so this was my master's work. It was on characterization of iron oxides, and I worked with Bob Gath, who was had come to Minnesota from Oak Ridge, had a lab that was sponsored by the Atomic Energy Commission. So he and I arrived at the same time, and he was my advisor on both my master's and PhD, just a terrific guy. So he was a clay mineralogist, and so the AEC was very interested in the work he was doing on exchange selectivity, because at places like Oak Ridge, to get rid of the waste, the low-level waste, it was funneled into a lake, White Oak Lake, and soil or clay mineral retention, like especially on illitic materials, was really what was keeping it from moving further downstream. So clay mineralogy was important, and there was a lot of soil science work that was funded by the AEC. So I did my master's on iron, and then was looking for a PhD topic. So this book, unfortunately, I don't have my original copy, but it was published in 1969. It was written for like a lay high school, college audience, with there were some technical details that were pretty sophisticated. But I'm just looking at it. My advisor knows radioactive waste. I've been interested in it since the 1964 World's Fair. You could get a dime that had been irradiated, and I still have 2 of these, I think. So, so since '64, I was interested in radioactivity, really. So then in '69, this book comes out. In '72, I'm looking for a thesis topic, and I'm reading this book, and I find this. What is this? I find this element, never heard of it, couldn't pronounce it. So I go and talk to Dr. Gast, and we look around. There's very little data on it. The only data shows that at Hanford, it's really moving rapidly. So this graph has ruthenium, but ruthenium, nitrate, and technetium were all occurring in anionic forms. So technetium occurs at TCO4 minus. So therefore, it was not being retained by ion exchange on clays. So we wrote a grant at AEC, and we wound up a 5-year grant that funded me and several other grad students. So that was great. So we've talked about this, the double peak. I won't go into this. So let me just move on to. So sorry, this is a little cut off, but let me just tell you that the reason. So I got hired by USGS in 1978, I think, and the reason they hired me is because they had a high-level waste program, a low-level waste, but nothing on uranium mill tailings. And this graph came out in Reviews of Modern Physics that showed after long periods, and at the USGS we talk about geologic time, so I forget where the cutoff was, but like after 10,000 years, uranium mill tailings have a higher radiotoxicity than high-level waste. So that is decided we need to have someone looking at uranium mill tailings. So that was me. So in '79, very soon after I started, we got like a call. I remember it was on a Friday. We've got this problem in Denver. We've discovered this dump that we don't really know what this is, but radioactive contamination all over the city of Denver. Or it started at one site, it grew. There was some knowledge that it was somehow connected to the U.S. Bureau of Mines. So this thing started growing beyond this. Eventually, it was a large number of sites. They were called the Denver Radium Site. It was multiple sites, 65. The classic one, though, was the parking lot under the IHOP on East Colfax, which is the main drag through Denver. One of the interesting things with this was when we went out doing a survey at the site, there was surface contamination in a lot of places at this one corner of this industrial site. Well, it turns out it was a place where they made tombstone, or they etched tombstones. And the way they would do that is sandblasting. They would cut out the name and dates of the person. They would put a heavy rubber sheet on the thing, and then the sandblaster would move along like this. So every place that it deposited the sand was hot, because things like zircon and monazite, these are minerals that have uranium and thorium in them. So monazite is a major player in the story that I'm working on today, so this was a good lesson for me. Just very briefly, this was a fascinating site because it was a landfill, and you could still read the newspapers in it. And I would really like to do some research. If anyone would like to think about a study on this carbonization of newspaper. I mean, literally, we could go in and we'd just reach, we'd pull it out, and you didn't have to do any kind of sophisticated data. You would pull it out and read the date on the newspaper. It was just unbelievable. Big thicknesses of this looked like carbon paper, but the ink was still readable. So I think there's something. I've Googled carbonized paper, but I can't find anything. So moving quickly. So I got into a lot of looking at patents because the radium industry that created all this waste was very secretive. They did not publish journal articles. So patents were the entree to try to figure out what is this material. And so let's see, by 82, so I had started digging into, trying to find out what is the material, what is the history of this material. So I wrote this paper, the first nuclear industry, because this is pre-fission now, and sent it to Scientific American unsolicited, and they took it. So I'm very pleased. It's the only paper I have with Chivas Regal liquor. And look at this, the new Ford LTD is right there, interspersed with my pages. So recently, Dava Sobel, who's a former New York Times science writer, was doing this book on Marie Curie. She contacted me about 2 years ago, and we just started talking about radium, and she would bounce things off me. And the best one was the cover design, because they were trying to decide, should it be green or blue? And so if you read, so Marie Curie's daughter wrote a book about Marie, and in there she describes, she would hold up these tubes of radium, they would glow blue. But most people are more familiar with this green color from watch dials and the like that were painted. This is a different reaction. This is the reaction of radium with zinc sulfide, and it fluoresces green. So in this movie, not the good movie, but this movie used the green color. But the Cherenkov radiation effect that you see in the pool of our reactor here, that's really where the blue comes from. So in the end, so it was green and blue, and that's how the cover evolved. And so this is just another. The nice thing about working with Scientific American, they do wonderful graphics. Again, art director, something we don't typically have. So there was this in the original Bureau of Mines. They used a cascade of bathtubs. Literally, they would decant from one bathtub to another when they were purifying radium. And let me just skip a few of these. Okay, but I want to move to Wendy, so thank Wendy. She brought up in her seminar, everything old is new again, and that's what I wanted to get to. Okay, so in 87, so after I had written the Scientific American, I was left with all of this stuff left over. And what am I going to do with this? So I wrote this monograph, Buried Treasure to Buried Waste, because radium was worth $120,000 a gram at its peak, and then it went to zero. You had to pay people to take your radium at the end. So the story is this, I think, fascinating story of buried treasure to buried waste. But so this is when it really got to the bottom. For about 20 years in the 60s and 80s, the EPA and the Public Health Service collected unwanted radium sources, 140 curies. That's a lot of radium. The Shimatsu story I told you, that was 1 curie. This is 140 curies. And in 83, that whole supply was buried at Hanford. Okay, now 2024, I told you about the medical isotopes. Radium-226 is in incredible demand. The price is skyrocketing. The price is, I did a calculation that it's about the same, 120,000 a gram translated into $2,024, they're almost equivalent. In other words, it's selling for about $1 million a gram at this point, and you can't get it. There is none because it's all been put into geologic repositories. So here's a company, this is the only operating uranium mill in the US, but they've just gotten into the medical isotopes field. Let's get that. Okay, so the reason they want this is it's called TAT, Targeted Alpha Therapy. So you attach an alpha emitter to a molecule that will bind to sites on cancer cells. And so this is a huge breakthrough in chemistry. The limiting factor now is we just don't have enough radium. Okay, so let me skip to the basis of this radiation study I'm doing, and I will wrap it up in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So if you like acronyms, the nuclear remediation is the field for you. So I worked on uranium mill tailings, that's UMTRA, the Uranium Mill Tailings Remedial Action Act. There's another act called FUSRAP, Formally Utilized Site Remedial Action Program. So if you look at the distribution, the UMTRA sites are all in the west. This is where the uranium deposits are. These were all sites, the FUSRAP, that processed material from the Manhattan Project. Okay, so they're scattered all over the place. So I was reading this report, in 2013, I read it in like 2021 or something, because it's still of interest to me. The Westlake site is one of the FUSRAP sites. And this was a table in there. And so one of the tables is, one of the items is captured Japanese uranium-containing sands. So this is when that EKG blip, 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 what is that? What does that mean? So it couldn't figure what this meant. So it turns out, let me skip that and move on. So I wrote the author, and he said, hi, never heard of this before. I said, the implication is that the Japanese were doing nuclear weapons research in World War II. Agree? He doesn't respond. So I decided, well, I'm going to find out myself. So Wikipedia, believe it or not, had an article just like this on the Japanese. It wasn't a big secret, okay? Yeah, the Japanese did have a nuclear weapons project, and indeed, this material that's now buried in St. Louis is part of that project. So at that point, I was just hooked on the topic, and the rest is history. I'll just show you some pictures. This is in Japan, let's see, summer before last. So that picture I showed you at Berkeley with the magnetic yoke, these are some of the accelerators, early accelerators at the lab that was involved with this work. And there's the Berkeley picture again. So I contacted the National Archives, and within 11 days got tremendous guidance on, because I didn't know where to start on this. This archivist has just been tremendous. So I think I probably should leave it at that, and thank you.